Today, I'll show you my Sony ZV-E1 settings and custom buttons for YouTube content creation. I think that customizing a camera is very important because it allows you to work more efficiently, and by playing with all of the settings, you become more familiar with the camera, so it's a win-win situation. However, keep in mind that my settings and custom buttons may not work well for you because your workflow is different, but I still think that you will benefit from watching this video. With that said, let's get started with the settings. Starting with the shooting menu, I set the file format to XAVC S4K with 140 MB 10-bit record setting for 25p and 200 MB 10-bit record setting for 50p. I shoot an XAVC S because it has a good balance between video quality and space. The SI file format takes up too much space, and the HS file format does not work with 25 frames per second for whatever reason. However, if you want the absolute best video quality from the ZV-E1, you should shoot in the SI file format, but you will need very expensive V90 SD cards. I don't think it's worth it for just shooting YouTube videos. Then in the log shooting setting, I enable log shooting with color gamut S-Log3, S-Gamut 3 Cine, and disable embed LUT file. This will completely disable the picture profile and set the camera to S-Log3 by default. That doesn't bother me because I shoot in S-Log3 99% of the time anyways. However, it will also allow you to import custom LUTs with the option of baking them into the footage to save time in post-production, but I disabled that option because I prefer to do it myself. Then in lens compensation, I turned on everything including breathing compensation. This basically will fix any minor artifacts that Sony lenses have, such as distortion, chromatic aberration, shading, and focus breathing. The breathing compensation adds a 5-10% crop, but I highly recommend using it, especially if you like focus tracking shots. Also, as far as I know, these settings will work only on native Sony lenses. Then in shoot mode, I use manual exposure and don't have any memory recall presets. I manually expose all of my shots, and because this camera doesn't have a mode dial, I find using the memory recall presets useless because anyways you have to go to the menu to enable them, which takes the same amount of time as manually changing the settings. Then I enable audio recording and manually adjust the audio record level each time. I only use external microphones, so I don't change anything when it comes to the built-in microphone. Then in image stabilization, I disable steady shot and framing stabilizer. I have a custom button for steady shot that I will show you later on, and I'm not planning on using framing stabilizer anytime soon. Then in zoom range, I select clear image zoom with a zoom lever speed of 5. Clear image zoom now supports autofocus, and cropping in a little bit in camera can be useful at times. It does reduce slightly the video quality, but I like having the option. Then in shooting display, I activate the grid line display and emphasize the record display. This will add a rule of thirds grid and also a red box around the screen to indicate when the camera is recording. Then in the shooting option, I disable everything because I don't use these features. Moving on to the exposure/color menu. In metering mode, I use multi-metering with face priority enabled, and in white balance, I use custom white balance with a slight shift towards blue and magenta. And then in color/tone, I disable the soft skin effect and use a custom LUT that I manually imported. Remember when we were in log shooting and I told you that you could import custom LUTs? This is where you do it. I think you can upload up to 16 custom LUTs, but log shooting must be enabled in order to use them. Moving on to the focus menu, I use continuous autofocus and set the autofocus speed and sensitivity to 3. This number, however, may change depending on the shooting situation. Then in focus area, I choose wide, limit the focus area to wide and spot medium, and set the focus area color to red. I have a custom button for switching between focus areas that I will show you later on, and I limit my focus area to wide and spot medium because that's all I use. I usually use wide when I'm filming myself, like right now, and I use spot medium for everything else. Then I turn on subject recognition autofocus with human as recognition target. Moving on to the operation customize menu, I select all of the options in different settings for stills and movie. This separates photo and video settings. You can customize it however you want, but I select everything because I want totally separate settings for photo and video. Then I enable record with shutter, touch operation, and set the monitor brightness to sunny weather. I prefer to record with the shutter button, and because this camera lacks a joystick, I use the touch screen to point the focus, and I like having my screen as bright as possible to properly expose and compose my shots. but it will deplete the battery a little bit faster. Finally, in display option, I enable display LUT. In the power setting option, I set the auto power off temp to high, and in the setup option, I turn on the record lamp. So I want to be able to preview my custom LUTs on the screen, as well as see the recording lamp in front of the camera, and by setting the auto power off temp to high, I can record for longer periods of time without the camera overheating as quickly. Okay, we're done with the settings. Let's move on to video button and function menu customization. Starting with the button customization, which can be found on page 4 of the setup menu, I set the control dial to aperture and the control wheel to shutter speed. Nothing fancy, it's self-explanatory, but I wish there was a front dial to change the ISO. Moving on to the lens button, I set mine to peak in display select. This will enable and disable focus peaking. I use this a lot when manually focusing, but if your lens does not have a lens button, this is pretty useless. Then for the top buttons, I set custom button 1 to switch focus area and the movie button to record frame rate. Like I previously said, I always change the focus area depending on what I am shooting, and I'm using the C1 button to do that. And with the record button, I'm changing the frame rate from 25p to 50p, and in the future it's also going to be 100p. Finally, for the rear buttons, I set custom button 2 to AF on, which basically locks the focus when in autofocus mode to prevent the camera from hunting for focus. Then with the delete button, I simply enable and disable steady shot, while the center button selects my white balance and the right button the ISO. Finally, the left and down buttons are in charge of zebras. A quick optional tip, you can customize one of the buttons to my dial 1, 2 or 3. In this example, I'll change the top C1 button to toggle my dial 1. Then in my dial settings, you can change the dials to pretty much whatever you want. For example, let's set my dial 1 to audio gain and ISO. And now when I press the C1 button, you will notice that the control wheel changes the ISO and the control dial changes the audio gain. If I press the C1 button again, it returns to changing the shutter and aperture. If you want to add additional functions to the control and wheel dial, this can be very useful. Let's move on to the function menu customization. I have audio record level to quickly change audio gain, grid line display to enable disable the grid line, select LUT if I want to use a different LUT, and subject recognition and autofocus, which enables disables subject tracking. So I leave it on when I'm filming myself, but for example, if I shoot a product B-roll or something like that, I turn it off because I don't want the camera to hunt for a human subject or something like that. Then I have the autofocus, shift sensitivity and transition speed. I usually leave it at 3, but depending on the situation, I may change it. Finally, I use the touch function to toggle between touch tracking and touch focus. This is very useful because the camera doesn't have a joystick to move the focus point, and I like having the touch tracking if I want to focus track something. And there you have it, all of my settings and custom buttons on the Sony ZV-E1 for YouTube. I didn't go through everything because I don't use everything. I just went over the most important features of this camera that will benefit my workflow or even yours. Thank you for watching.